Hey, BattleTech buddies. So this one goes out to a viewer screen named Zydark, who mentioned a while back that they would like to see a video talking about how do you use long-range missile boats in BattleTech. So here are my thoughts on that. My answer to the question is that there isn't a single one way to use missile boats, because there are actually three different types of missile boats that I see in the game, and they have somewhat different tactics for how to use them. The first variety of missile boat that I would point your attention to is exemplified by the longbow LGB-0W. This is an exemplar of a kind of missile boat that I would call like a pure indirect fire support mech. These are kind of the easiest ones to use, I think, out of the three categories. What makes for a pure fire support mech is that it's not that strong on the defense. Either it's not very well armored, or maybe it has an extra light engine which makes it more vulnerable to enemy fire. And it's got a whole ton of LRMs, a whole, heavy battery of LRMs to use to hammer enemy mechs at a long distance. So another example of this kind of mech in the 30-50s period would certainly be the Salamander. The Salamander is well armored, but it has an extra light engine, so it's not going to stand up super well to enemy fire. And it has also a whole lot of ammunition on board, which increases its vulnerability. And it only carries, like the longbow, 2 medium lasers as a backup weapons platform. So as I was saying, the way you want to use a mech like this longbow, is pretty straightforward. You just place it in a location that doesn't have line of sight to the majority of the battlefield, but that does have good range to the location where your enemy has their forces deployed, or where you expect their forces to end up. So this is the kind of position that I want to put that longbow in. Then you're going to, of course, put your other mechs forward of the longbow and have them get into line of sight so that they can spot for the longbow to enable its indirect fire. Now, what about the kind of classic, most classic long-range missile mech, the Archer? I would actually lump the Archer in terms of its role with the Crusader. The Archer is a mech that carries a lot of armor. It's pretty well protected for a long-range missile mech. And so you want to use it as a kind of direct fire battle line missile mech. You can use it like a longbow, but it's not 100% ideal for that because it's got all of that armor. And you don't want that armor to be going to waste. You want that armor to be soaking up attacks from your enemies. So in battle, you want to be kind of aggressive and fearless with your archers. Move them up the way that I'm doing here so that they have kind of direct fire lines of sight to enemy mechs. And a really nice thing about an LRM mech in this role is that if you're using it as a battleline mech, you can move it really early in the initiative order. You can move it first, usually, out of all your mechs, because you don't need to worry too much about getting into line of sight with enemy mechs. So for example, in the situation pictured here, if I were using a direct fire mech in this role, I would worry if I moved it into the location that I'm moving the Archer, that the Wolverine would just back out of my line of sight, and then that mech's weapons would go to waste. If I was using a Warhammer in this role, that would be my concern. But with the Archer, even if the Wolverine does back up, I can still move the Thunderbolt into position to spot for the Archer, and then the Archer's missiles will not go to waste. They will still be fired this turn and have a chance to do damage either to the Wolverine or to the Vindicator behind it. Of course, you want to have other battle line mechs with direct fire capabilities and shorter range weapons out in front of the Archer if you're using it like this, like I do with the Thunderbolt here in this illustration, because of course if I just had the Archer and that was my only mech on this part of the battlefield, then the Wolverine would just run right in front of me with impunity and use its short-range weapons to hurt the Archer. In this situation, it can't safely do that, because if it does, it will be at risk of a rear attack from the Thunderbolt. So the third and final category of missile boats that I think has a very different tactical style from the other two is exemplified by the Dervish that you see here. These are what I would call cavalry or flanker missile boats. They're missile boats that have, a significant amount of long-range missile firepower, but they also move quickly and maybe have jump capability, which is especially good for this kind of role. So the Dervish is, in a way, the kind of paradigm because it goes 5.85, which is quite fast and has plenty of jump capability for this period. You could potentially lump the catapult into this role because it does jump 4. In 3025, the catapult can fill this role, but in later eras, the catapult is not fast enough to really function like a cavalry mech anymore. Now, what I want to do with the Dervish's indirect fire capability, if I can, is to get around my enemy's flank into their rear, hopefully, and get to an angle where I can fire the Dervish's LRMs with indirect fire to protect the Dervish, fire those LRMs into the rear arc of enemy mechs. So you can see in this image, this is exactly the kind of position that the Dervish wants to be in because the enemy mechs have their backs to the Dervish. If they turn around and start to chase towards the Dervish, then their backs will be to my front line mechs and they'll receive more fire to their rears. But in this position, the front line mechs get to spot for the Dervish gets to fire its LRMs at the enemy mechs, and if they hit, they have a good chance of doing rear torso damage, blowing through, hitting ammo, inflicting criticals quickly, those kinds of things. So in this kind of a situation, you want to focus the fire from your frontline mechs on one of the enemy mechs, and then pick a different enemy mech that you can spot to, and fire on that mech into the rear with the Dervish. That way you're not wasting shots wearing down the enemy's front torso armor and their rear torso armor at the same time. And the Dervish's fire has a good chance to destroy or cripple the mech that it's firing at. And additionally, you're also damaging another mech with your frontline mechs. So this is one of the occasions when focusing fire in BattleTech actually is not ideal. As I've said before in some of my videos, just one of the ideal positions to be in BattleTech is to have your enemy caught in a crossfire, because then they don't have an option that doesn't endanger their rear torsos, which are the really vulnerable parts of mechs. Now, this isn't everything I have to say about how to use LRM boats, but it's a good start, so hopefully it will be useful to you in putting long-range missile mechs to use in your games.